Tracy, you ready for me to let people in?
Yes, I'm ready, Katie.
Excellent. Oh, no.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the PCEF committee meeting. We will be going from 6 to 8:30 tonight. My name is Tracy Smith. I'm the facilitator. And Katie, do you have the slide that goes over meeting protocols available? So again, with this virtual hybrid participation, we want to ensure a successful meeting. If you have use of the chat box, that is only going to be for PCEF staff. So at the appropriate times, please make sure you share your comments. Also tonight, we have a lot of presentations. It will be important for you to raise your hand, and that way I can see you and call on you. And the video, we will be for committee only, and the microphones will be muted. The meeting will be recorded, and there is captioning. And for the captioning, you'll need to turn those on if you need closed captioning. And then we will have a break around 7 o'clock, and that break will be for about 10 minutes. Okay. At this point, we'll move over to our agenda. So we'll start with introductions, public comment, we'll do a timeline update, and then we'll have several presentations beginning with the community engagement update on the climate investment plan. From there, Portland's 2020 carbon emissions and pathway analysis. As I said just a second ago, we'll have a break at 7 o'clock, and then back to the 2020 carbon presentation. At 7:30, the Climate Investment Plan Funding Initiative template will be presented. 7:45, the update on the strategic program. 8:20, we'll have a report out, and then at 8:30, the meeting will close. So at this point, I would like to recognize committee members. I'll start off. Are there any committee members in the room at PCC?
We've got 3.
Okay. Can you, Sam, have people, the 3, introduce themselves, please?
Yeah, let's start right over here and go right around.
Good evening, Robin Wang, committee member, he, him.
And then, hi everybody, Megan Horst, she, her, committee member and co-chair.
Hello, Maria Sippin, they, she pronouns, PCEF committee member.
All right. Hello to all of you. Faith, I see you online. I'll start with you.
Hi there. Good evening, everyone. Committee member Faith Graham. I use she, her pronouns.
Michael.
Good evening, everybody. Michael Eden Hill, committee member, he, him.
And Ranfis. So Ranfis, I saw a lot of emails, text in the chat. I'm not sure if you're not feeling well. I hope that's not the case, but if you could introduce yourself.
Ranfis Giannatino Vittoro, committee member. Thanks.
All right. And Sam, would you like PCEF staff to be introduced?
Yeah. Let's do it. Katie.
Evening, everyone. I'm Katie Lister. I use she, her pronouns with PCEF team.
Sam, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. James Valdez, he, him pronouns, PCEF staff.
And I'm going to acknowledge Rachel in the back here, Rachel Gilmore, supporting us, putting this on. Thank you. Then Sam Brasi here, PCEF staff, he, him pronouns. And I'll introduce CR here shortly in a minute too. Oh, and we've got June Reyes online joining us, who will be presenting shortly as well. June, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good evening. June Reyes, they, she, her pronouns, PCEF staff.
All right, are there any other staff members that I may have missed? All right, we'll move over into public comment at this time.
I think we have one public commenter. Kathy Tuttle, please come up here to the table and share your comments. And want to see if there are others online that have public comments, welcome you all, just chatting that and letting us know or indicating that you're interested in providing public comment.
Hi, I'm Kathy Tuttle, she, her, and I'm representing Bike Loud PDX. And I just wanted to say that I'm delighted that PCEF is starting to look at transportation as part of its climate action, because it's so important. Not just for people who bike, but for everyone. There are at least 40% of the people of Portland, because of poverty, because of disability, or because of age, cannot drive. And I think it's great that PCEF is actually putting some effort and some real resources into that, addressing those issues. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Kathy. Is there anyone online that has public comment?
Hi, yeah, I'm raising my hand, but I don't know if you're seeing it. Is it?
Oh, I do now, Jeff. How are you? Welcome.
Hi, yeah, my name is Jeff Lane. I am a development finance manager at the Housing Authority in Portland called Home Forward. I'm just here. I had a question more than a comment, but I was wondering if this is not the appropriate time. I jumped in late, so I apologize if you introduced when like a Q&A period would be.
Well, this would be the time, Jeff. We don't have a specific Q&A time, so if you have a question, now's the time.
Sure, yeah. So I was wondering specifically about, so I develop affordable housing and I was hoping to secure some PCEF funding. And I'm really glad that PCEF is putting that as a priority and making sure that affordable housing and linking sustainability goals is, you know, something that we've been wanting to do. And OHCS, the Oregon Housing and Community Services, and PHB, the Portland Housing Bureau, and Metro have all aligned green building standards with their funding sources. And I was wondering if PCEF is planning to do the same as far as aligning aligning their green building standards and their funding dollars to those other funders of affordable housing, so that we as a funder don't have to make design changes and accommodate one funding source just to get this source of funding, when it would be great to have them all synced up and, you know, working together on the same goals, and because it's really costly to redesign projects, especially ones that are pretty much like done at this point and just waiting to close. I know that there's the $60 million that was fast tracked, and that came up at the meeting, I believe, yesterday, and they told me to come to this meeting and talk to y'all about it.
Sam, would you like to respond or identify someone who can respond to Jeff?
Yes, thank you, Tracy. Jeff, appreciate. I think what we'll be doing is towards the latter half of this meeting, we will be talking about that strategic program and giving more information on that program. So what I'd encourage you to do is, I know that's towards the back end of the meeting, but either sticking around or taking a look at the recording afterwards and then connecting with us if you've got questions after that.
Sure. Okay, great. I'll plan to do that then. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff. Is there anyone else online that has public comment? All right, we'll move into the timeline update.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Ciara Pressler with Pregame, working with PCEF on the climate investment plan. Wanted to bring our committee briefing timeline for the next 9-ish months back to you all with some updates. We spent a lot of time outlining all the steps we would need to take to create a strong draft for each program that's part of the climate investment plan. And from that, we took when we could realistically bring you a briefing as well as update you a second time. One of the things we heard from you in your vision for this process is that we would have more than one opportunity to talk about a lot of these things, and also that you would be able to hear about the community engagement step. And so we've moved things around a little bit from the last time, and this is a more accurate agenda for the next several months. So a few things will happen in small group briefings in March, just because we have so much to do in February, March, and April in order to have a draft, I believe, in May. But here we are in December with the agenda for tonight. January, we will update that agenda as soon as we know it, probably in the first or second week of January. We'll tackle administrative rulemaking. In February, we will start in earnest with some briefings. We'll already be off and running with regulated multifamily affordable housing, which is broken into 2 phases. And with capacity building, community centers, and equitable tree canopy, as well as the mini grant program update. In March, the first week, in the small group briefing, which is scheduled for March 2nd, first week, we'll get back to regulated multifamily affordable housing phase 2, capacity building and community centers. So you'll see in the parentheses, some of these it's 1 briefing, some of these it's 1 of 2 or 2 of 2. Next slide. And then in March, first briefing on the other categories, April 2nd briefing for the remaining. We will probably realistically welcome new committee members in that March meeting. We'll also have the update on heat response, which is still happening concurrently. We'll want to spotlight a grantee if we have time in April. And then in May, getting back to administrative rulemaking, looking at some of the program metrics and the dashboard that has been being designed throughout, and look at how we're going to go through the draft. So June, July, there'll also be public comment happening through some of this. So June and July will be draft iteration, and then by the end of July, have a draft that you feel comfortable recommending to council. So I hope this looks more manageable. Any questions?
Sorry, my eyes are getting old. Can you email this if it's not in the packet?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, yeah, a couple of quick questions. Can you clarify what admin rulemaking, like what does that entail for us specifically? That's one, and I'm curious about questions I've had over the last few meetings about when we'll discuss the disability community. I'm curious if that's part of that. Another one is, where does our community-based RFP fit in this timeline? Like, when are we releasing 3?
Yeah, I'll defer those over to Katie or Sam.
Thank you. The first meeting and I think I'm going to go back to it, will be in January, was where we're going to be outlining what are the elements of admin rulemaking, because it's going to take phases. And so there's a few things that we already know we need to address that are just core elements of setting some of the boundaries around the program, as well as starting to discuss definitions for trainee. So we'll be coming to that and outlining what are elements of that admin rulemaking package that we'll be working on in the January meeting. So we've got a rough outline of what we think we'll bring, but the intent is to keep that as a manageable piece of work so that we can move some of the pieces of work that we do need to move forward. So the expectation is in January to outline what we're discussing, and then tee that up, and then bring that back to you all in fuller discussion in, I think that's April. In terms of the question around disability community, I think what you'll see later on in the presentation is there's I think one, I want to just acknowledge it's a larger and a very complex conversation. And so there's going to be many ways in which we'll be thinking about and talking about how we are inclusive, serving, or accessible, thinking through accessibility for the disability community or people experiencing disabilities. And so I maybe would just ask that you keep on that and keep seeing where that shows up, but we will talk a little bit about that and point that out later today in our presentations. And the community RFP, thank you. RFP number 3. So as part of all of these discussions, and I think we're just coming out of even our kickoff session yesterday, we've been thinking about how to bring greater clarity into how all these pieces are aligning and when different things are expected to come up. But what we're expecting as we start fleshing out and going through the roundtable conversations that June will highlight again, that's where it'll start to give us shape and understanding what are the things that sit within or appropriate for community responsive grants versus strategic programs. And so as we go through those conversations, it will be informing how the community responsive grants are shaking out. And so I think what we can do is come back and see where how we more clearly speak to that through this process. But the gist is it's sort of sprinkled throughout this that we'll be talking about, okay, these are strategic programs. Well, this may not fit for a strategic program. This is more suitable for a community responsive grant. And so you'll see that more towards the end in its wholeness as you see the entire climate investment plan and where all those fit together. But I do have another slide here that'll speak a little bit more to that as well. So we'll work on bringing, maybe I just want to acknowledge, Megan, we'll work on bringing clarity to how community responsive grants fit in. And some of this is as much for us, for you all, as well as the public in terms of helping folks see how all the pieces are going to start to fit. And so I suspect some of those are just going to be some visuals that we work on.
Any other timeline questions?
Ciara, maybe if I could just add one thing to Megan's specific question about the timing of the RFP 3, the community responsive grants. We think the community responsive grant allocation and sort of description will be part of the climate investment plan. So it really is like once that's buttoned up, recommended to council, council approves, then we will have the authority to release the community responsive grant RFP number 3. So likely fall 2023.
All right, thank you.
Are there any further questions for Ciara? All right, let's move on to the community engagement update. And June, I'm assuming that's you.
I did, apologies, Sarah. I added a couple slides because I did want to, and this is, okay. We didn't create a break in this because it was really, as we thought through the timeline and the agenda, this was an ask that I think in our conversations with Megan and Renfis last week, trying to differentiate some of the work that's happening here. And so within what was adopted by City Council in late October, there's both the funding priorities, which you see here listed on the chart here to the left, all the various funding priorities that are going to need to take shape within the climate investment plan. And then there's the 2 programs that were already adopted and fast track that we're actively working on. And so I wanted to acknowledge that and for both of those, while there's different approaches to them, we're certainly thinking about them in parallel and thinking about them and maintaining the consistency with some of the work that we're doing within our broader climate investment plan. So as we think about the fast track programs, we are we're trying to make sure our community engagement aligns in very similar forms, but these 2 are moving on a faster track. And so what I wanted to speak to, and this goes to a little bit of that timeline, Megan, that you spoke to, as we go through these 2 fast track programs, what we're looking for, they've already been approved. They were adopted, but what we're looking here, and one of the programs we'll talk about this evening, is for input and feedback. So that's what we're looking for as we talk through those 2 initial programs. And you see here in this sort of branch diagram, we're trying to show that we're working through the development of the climate investment plan at the same time developing and launching these initial 2 programs. And then we have the CIP development and really getting into those funding allocations and priorities. And so there, similarly, over the course of the next 6 months, we'll consistently be bringing back to you each month briefings and seeking your input and feedback that we'll continue to take back and incorporate with some of what we're hearing within our stakeholder roundtables. Then the expectation is come towards June and July for you all to see the fullness, the full entirety of the climate investment plan after we've gone out for public comment, after we worked with our community review panel. You will see that full plan and begin your full deliberations where you see how it all comes together. And I think that's the piece that I know folks are going to want to see, and that is where it's going to come, is where after we've gone through and iteratively built out each of the sections, it's that bringing it all together. And so as you see in this graphic here, once that, we anticipate that if you all are making the recommendations at the end of July to City Council, they take up action on it in early September, and we turn around and roll out RFP number 3 in early fall.
Is that viable? I mean, seems really tight between when the council approves it and when you launch the RFP.
There will inevitably, I think there's always that downtime between when you all make a recommendation, we start working on packaging it up, and then briefing council. So and then making sure, you know, submitting all of our documentation and needed for council. But through that period of time, we'll be working on. I mean, we'll have a good sense for what's shaking out. I mean, the good thing is we've run RFP 1, 2, and so there's a framework there for us to tweak, adjust, and build on. And so I think that our expectation, recognizing that there's eager interest in RFP number 3, is to keep as close to the schedule as we can.
Sam, do you have more slides?
This is it for me now. Thank you, Tracy, and apologies.
All right. So are there any final questions for Sam? We'll move on to June, and then June will take questions at the end of her update.
All right, thank you all. I think one question I wanted to kind of have you all think about as I just cover this for the next 2 or 3 minutes is I want to learn what you are interested in hearing about in a monthly update to you about community engagement, just so that I can kind of have the things that you are most interested as part of the update. So we can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to update you all that we had our kickoff yesterday evening at 5 o'clock. This kickoff was really about letting folks know about the process, the multiple opportunities for them to engage, and we also put out an accessibility survey. So I'm just gonna make sure I paste that into the chat for y'all to share out if you can. And the point was we wanted to talk about the process before we really dived in and asked people for input, just so that they could feel more ready to engage. And that way we could really just learn how we would need to maybe modify our engagement plan to be able to be more inclusive. And so for that event yesterday evening, we had about 83 in attendance, and that wasn't counting City of Portland staff. So we did have 169 register. And so I think part of that is just showing that there's a lot of interest, and those are also folks we'll be following up with materials from the meeting. And as I said, the accessibility survey is up and running, and it closes on January 4th. We're also going to be releasing an application for the topic roundtables. And so just as a reminder, what those are basically a series of 2 meetings for each topic area. And the whole point is to be able to put out a robust first draft for public comment. And so after folks kind of put, the folks in the topic roundtable help put together an initial sort of, I guess, preliminary draft, we're going to have the public provide comment in March, and then we're going to have that more robust, like 80% draft in April/May for folks to look at. So folks will have 2 opportunities. And I just put in a graphic here, just a screenshot of the Zoom polls. And so just to see, for y'all to know who was in the room, I would say about half of the folks there were folks from nonprofits, some consultants. We had a dozen just folks who just identified as interested community members. There were a lot of folks there who wanted details on specific funding priorities, but there are also several folks who were just interested in what the climate investment plan was and what were the opportunities to provide input. And so at the end of the meeting, we asked folks if they would be interested in participating in the plan. Most folks yes, and I did not even put a no. So folks accidentally did not get a chance to say no. And so the events folks are interested in, you kind of see it spans across their, folks seem to be interested in a little bit of everything from the in-person workshops to virtual info sessions, online surveys, and specific nonprofit workshops. And so the last question was, how satisfied were folks with the opportunities to participate? Folks generally seemed like they were fine with it or they were pretty satisfied, though we did get a very dissatisfied. So can we go to the next slide? And so I kind of want to just mark where we're at in this process. And so, you know, we did the kickoff and now we're going to be kind of heading towards this community vision and priorities piece. So the events that are going to come up with that are going to be a virtual information session, an in-person workshop on January 28th, a nonprofit workshop on February 1st, and then meanwhile, we'll also have an online survey open. So I think those are some of the things we're putting together, you know, a toolkit for folks to be able to share this information, and we'll make sure that you all get them. But I would mark your calendars if there is an event that you'd be interested in going to. For example, the January 28th in-person workshop, which will be at the core food carts on 82nd. And so I will kind of come back and kind of orient us of where we are in the process and an update by using this kind of slide. But I guess this is where my update ends, and I would love to hear what are the things generally and these monthly updates you would like to hear, and if you have any questions for me.
Faith?
Question. One question. I absolutely remember the topic roundtables, of course, but I don't remember the purpose of the application. Can you just remind me of what one is applying for?
Yeah, so that's the topic roundtable application. So folks would be applying to be part of this 8-person roundtable. And so there would be, and the purpose of the roundtable is to really kind of bring a diverse perspective into being able to write this sort of first go at like a draft of the CIP. And so really we didn't want to write it alone in a, you know, and just kind of release it out. We wanted to be in sort of a transparent process of this is how it's being put together, and noting that this is a really fast-paced sort of schedule. How do we get the, you know, a really robust and thoughtful draft out there for folks to start with? And so we'll be putting out the application. We're going to be emailing that out tomorrow for folks to express interest, and really kind of limiting it to 8 people to be able to do that deeper deliberation and discussion about the topic.
Are there any other questions for June? Michael?
Hi, I was just wondering if there is any chance that we could get, if at any point you start getting written feedback, sort of comments on how it's going for the people that are attending info sessions and workshops and surveys. If we could get those and, you know, just, we don't have to discuss them. If we could just get access to them to kind of see how it's going.
Yeah, for sure. We definitely have lots of notes from the yesterday's event, and we can share some of those with you all.
Robin, and then Megan after Robin.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. 2 questions. One, in terms of who's at the table last week or yesterday, I guess. Do you have any information about, you know, race or age, just demographic information of who showed up? And secondly, are there opportunities for committee members to participate in the roundtables, or is it intentionally that we're not supposed to be involved?
Yeah, so the first one for demographic information collected. So we didn't collect any demographic information for the meeting. We sort of just did an open invite, although we did do some targeted outreach to invite specific folks there. The accessibility survey that we're pushing out has some demographic information around some of the right around race, as well as living with a disability, and some of these other demographic questions of interest, including birth year, so we can figure out if youth are participating and how to bring more in. And then in terms of the topic roundtables and committee members, I think we definitely want to hold space for a committee member to participate in a roundtable. And that I think is something that Sam, we had talked about bringing committee members in to participate on. And I think that specifically too would be like wearing the hat of bringing the expertise that you have, which is why you're sitting on that committee for specific topics.
Robin?
Well, Megan now, but my question was very similar to Robin's. And I was just curious, you asked June what we would want to know. And I think basically the same things Robin said, although my kind of additional or different lens would be, in addition to the demographics of the individuals, I'm just curious about the types of organizations that are participating, both in these general things, but also in the more targeted ones. Mainly, I want to just be sure that we're hearing from like the range of PCEF priority communities, so immigrant-led, Black-led, I'd want to know that. So both the individual and the like it might make sense for different contexts to understand those, and then for us to reflect if we've missed some, to like do something about that.
Got it, thank you.
Any final questions for June?
This is Maria. I have a question.
Sure, go ahead, Maria.
I heard a question yesterday from the audience at the kickoff about making meetings more inclusive and accessible in terms of having less technical content and making the climate investment material easier to connect with. Have we determined in this calendar of community input events which ones we might design more intentionally to be easier to understand for youth or people under 30, or to restructure how public meetings should be so that we can get the best quality input from people we don't usually engage with?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think this section that we're coming into, the community vision and priorities, these questions that are kind of shaping the what is it, 5 years after putting these investments into the city of Portland, what does that look like? What does climate resilience look like? So I think the broadest amount of participation can happen in the community vision and priorities. I think that, for example, the in-person kind of workshop will be kind of speaking to these broader priorities and experiences around people and their neighborhood and what they would like to improve in their quality of life. So I think if it's a specific time to push engagement, it would be this next section of community vision and priorities. I think there definitely is something there around that comment around making this more accessible even along the way. So, I think we still have a lot to think about how we make the preliminary draft section and the full draft for public comment more inclusive. And I think that might have to do with being able to connect back to the community vision and priorities and say, hey, did we get this right? So I think, so I appreciate you elevating that, Maria, and hopefully the community vision and priorities piece of it can kind of help us kind of create that wide opportunity for folks to come in, and then we can kind of track along that sort of vision and those priorities along the way.
All right, are there any other questions? All right, so we'll now move on to the 2020 carbon emissions and pathway analysis. Now, Kyle, I want to make sure we will take Q&A after your different segments of your presentation. Is that what you would like?
Yes, correct.
Is there anything specific you need from me while you're going through your presentations?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if you can kind of track any questions that come through, because I probably won't see the chat, but I will pause a couple times to check in with you on those.
Okay, if there are questions, I'll just wait until you're ready to take them, okay?
Okay.
All right.
All right, I'm going to share up. Host participant screen sharing is disabled.
Give me 1 second, Kyle. Boom.
While Sam's setting that up, I'll just say hello to everyone. I'm excited to be here. Some of you might remember I joined the very beginning when PCEF committee first convened. So I'm excited to be back and to share some of the work we're doing at BPS and give you kind of the background on our carbon emissions and some of the analytical work that's happening. Looks like I can share now, so get this going. Thank you, Sam. All right. So first, I just want to note I'm a climate policy analyst at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I've been working at BPS for going on 20 years now, so quite a while. I've been responsible for our emission inventories and some of the climate analysis work since about 2010. And we just recently, this last June, adopted a climate emergency work plan. And this work plan is really about how we implement the climate emergency declaration that was adopted by Council in 2020. So I want to note this because before I jump into discussion on emissions, because this plan is focused on the role of the city bureaus, but includes actions on buildings, energy systems, transportation, industry, embodied carbon, and resilience. And so it pairs very closely with the work that PCEF does and the kind of community investments you'll be making. So I see PCEF as really critical in terms of helping to provide resources to community to help us achieve the goals in the climate emergency declaration. So I think this work just really dovetails together nicely, and I'm excited about the CIP work that you're doing as you move forward. I will refer to the CEW, Climate Emergency Work Plan, periodically through my presentation. So first, I'm going to start with a carbon emissions overview for our 2020 carbon emissions, which is an odd year, but I think it gives us a little bit of insight in where we need to be rather than where we are today. So this set of data I'm going to show you is what we call sector-based emissions data or production-based emissions data. These are emissions that are produced in the city, in addition to electricity and landfill waste, which emissions occur outside of the city. And these are the emissions that City Council has used to set targets to reduce. And so for those of you who just a brief recap, because you guys probably all know this, but the goals adopted by Council are 50% reduction from 1990 levels by 2030 and 100% reduction to net zero carbon by 2050. Prior to the pandemic, we were right about 19% below 1990 levels. And I'm going to share where we are now. So this gives you a sense of kind of where we've been and how those emissions have been reduced since 1990. Multnomah County is there in the red compared to the United States. So you can see that we've actually accelerated our emissions reductions beyond what's happened at the national level, and that our emissions peaked in 2000. We're one of a handful of cities around the world that peaked emissions as early as 2000. And another note on that is, Portland was the first city in the United States to adopt a climate action plan back in 1993. So we have a long history of climate planning. And as a result, we've done all the easy stuff, the low-hanging fruit. So the work ahead of us is challenging. I want to focus here for a second just on this slope of this line. And you can see that in the recent years, it's been up and down quite a bit. That really has to do with the carbon intensity of the electric grid. But it's pretty flat overall when you look at that slope as compared to the slope from 2000 to about 2012, where we had much steeper reductions year over year. And the fact of the matter is, prior to the pandemic, we weren't anywhere near where we needed to be to hit those targets adopted by City Council. We really need to see much steeper curve on those lines year over year. So that's the challenge before us, is how do we bend that curve down much steeper? And I will show you now the big reveal on the 2020 emissions. Here you can see it dropped really significantly, both locally and nationally, for 2020. And our emissions in 2020 were a 25% reduction below 1990 levels as a result of the global COVID-19 pandemic. And at the same time, we've welcomed 42% more people to the city and 27% more jobs, including the pandemic job losses. And local emissions decreased 10% from 1990 to 2020. So real significant reduction just in that 1 year. But obviously that was driven by the pandemic and not more durable changes in terms of policy or consumer behavior. Our pandemic reductions resulted from lower industrial and commercial sector energy use, including 11% lower commercial electricity consumption and 9% lower industrial electricity consumption. Industrial natural gas consumption also declined about 13%. And the big number here, gasoline consumption, this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone who remembers 2020. Gasoline consumption dropped 17%, really due to that reduced daily vehicle miles traveled. However, we saw a spike in diesel emissions, likely having to do with more freight and home delivery services. If you were like me, you were ordering off Amazon and having things delivered to your door. So we did see a spike in diesel emissions as a result of that. Most of these reductions, again, are the result of external circumstances, the pandemic, and not the result of policy or permanent behavior change. We expect these emissions to generally return to pre-pandemic levels without further policy interventions that can more permanently affect economic and infrastructure systems within the city, as well as consumer behavior. And while Portland experienced a 10.5% reduction in carbon emissions in that 1 year, a large share of those reductions were from a 16% drop in electricity grid carbon intensity. And so what that means is the Northwest Power Pool, the grid that we are all on, had a 16% drop in the carbon emissions associated with the electricity produced through the Northwest Power Pool. And that was the result of more hydro generation in 2020. We had significantly more rainfall that year. That leads to more hydro generation. That reduces those carbon emissions. So while we did see an increase in energy use in the residential sector, as you can imagine, many of us were working from home, we actually see a drop in residential sector emissions because of that 16% drop in electricity grid. And I'm having a little problem here with my screen, so just 1 second. Oh, there we go. All right. I'm going to take a moment to talk about our sources of emissions. You can see here that electricity at 25% is our #1 source of carbon emissions. And that's actually fairly problematic right now because, as many of you know, electrification and renewable electricity are really key strategies for getting our carbon emissions to zero. So we've really prioritized renewable electricity as one of the top strategies in our climate emergency work plan. That's followed by gasoline at 24%, primarily used in the transportation sector. Natural gas, 22% of carbon emissions, and that's primarily used in residential and commercial buildings for heating and water heating. And diesel, I should also note, natural gas is also heavily used in the industrial sector. Diesel is the 4th largest source of carbon emissions at 17%, again, primarily used in the transportation sector, followed by some smaller sources of fossil fuels like fuel oil, propane, also residual oil, kerosene, all of these different fossil fuels in much smaller percentages than those top 4. We also have emissions from landfilled solid waste, and that's about 2% of our overall carbon emissions. What we've seen with landfill waste is that we've significantly reduced those emissions over time through the capture of methane at landfills, which has significantly increased since 1990. but our waste generation overall has not declined. And it has actually tracked with population growth over time. So we're not seeing the kinds of reductions in overall waste to landfills that we need to be seeing. In that other category you see noted there are a bunch of much smaller sources like wastewater treatment that do contribute to our overall emissions. As I mentioned, electricity is obviously really key here. So I want to take a moment to look at the grid mix for Portland. And this is a weighted average of PGE and Pacific Power based on their sales in Multnomah County. You can see that the largest source is natural gas, a fossil fuel, followed by coal, another fossil fuel. And I will note that Oregon has banned coal for electricity generation by 2030. So we should see that going away in the next few years, largely being replaced in the near term by natural gas. And over time, more and more renewables to hit the state's goal of 100% renewable by 2040. And BPS is working to accelerate that transition to 100% renewable. And it is the top priority in our climate emergency work plan because so many of our other actions depend on a clean electric grid. Here are our carbon emissions by sector, just to give you a sense of the scale and how these compare. Transportation is the largest source at 42%, followed by the commercial sector at 23%, residential at 18%, and in industrial following there at 13%. I will note, because a lot of the work you guys are doing are about rental properties and multifamily buildings, and those are sort of split between the commercial and industrial sector. It really depends on the total load of that building and how that building is metered. Some of them can be in residential, some of them can be in commercial. You might have common area lighting, for example, that could fall under a commercial account, and home heating could fall under residential. So it's hard to tease that out. I will talk about it a bit later, but we do have a model that really breaks out emissions and energy use from those different properties, really building that up from a property by property analysis, which I'll talk about towards the end of my presentation. Here we can see our emissions, how they've changed since that peak in 2000. You can see we've gotten significant reductions from the industrial sector. Really successful work there. It hasn't so much been driven by the loss of industry, but over time, industry shifting to less energy intensive industrial practices. So for instance, in 1990, we had aluminum smelting and other really energy and carbon intensive industries in Portland area that have gone away. We still have pretty consistent and stable use of industrial lands and industrial employment. So we haven't seen a loss of industrial jobs associated with that reduction. Single family residential has also been pretty successful in bringing down those emissions thanks to the work of PCEF and Energy Trust of Oregon and others who have been pushing for energy efficiency and renewables. And the commercial sector as well has made a bit of progress, but I want to really highlight transportation, where you can clearly see that we just have not made much progress on reducing those transportation sector emissions since that peak in 2000. Solid waste has come down again, as I mentioned, because of methane capture at landfills, not because of a reduction in solid waste. And you'll notice there on the right, we've got fugitive emissions. These are emissions that escape gas systems. So one, just our natural gas distribution system, some of that gas is able to escape, and we account for that. It also includes refrigerants that escape from refrigerators, AC units, and fire retardants, solvents, all of those kinds of products that produce different types of greenhouse gases. So those are counted under those fugitive emissions. We have seen those increase, but that is partially a function of the models that are used to account for fugitive emissions. We don't have really good data on fugitive emissions the way we do with, say, electricity or natural gas use, where we know exactly the kilowatt hour sales or the therm consumption. With fugitive emissions, we have to model that out, and it's based on population. So as our population has grown, those emissions have been forecasted to increase there. And we will need as we start getting past 2030 on our way to 2050, we'll need to really figure out better ways to measure fugitive emissions because they'll become a larger and larger share of our remaining carbon emissions. I just want to share a little bit about VMT because transportation is so important. And as I noted, we had a 17% reduction in gasoline sales in 2020. Here you can see that really since 2010, the blue line there is Portland only, daily VMT, so that's daily vehicle miles traveled per person, has been flat. And this makes sense when you think about it. We're not a growing city in the sense that we're expanding out or sprawling in the same way you might see in California or Texas. And because of that, the travel distances aren't getting longer. But because of that, we're adding many more people every year. And so the total transportation emissions continue to climb. Even though people aren't driving more on a daily basis, there are more people driving. And the big reveal for 2020 is just how that fell off a cliff when the pandemic kind of put a halt to a lot of our commute transportation. This is the kind of reductions that we really need to be seeing year over year, both in reductions in VMT and the carbon intensity of our transportation system. And so in order to get to those deep reductions, we're going to need to see this kind of a slope. And we know already from the data that's available that by the end of 2020, those transportation sector emissions recovered to pre-pandemic levels. So we really need further interventions that are going to drive those reductions down further. And I'm very excited to see PCEF stepping up to help address transportation sector emissions, as it's really a critical source and a key challenge for us. So I think we are right about time for the break, but maybe we can just take a couple minutes and see if folks have any questions on the first portion of my presentation, and then I'll finish up when we get back.
Sounds good, Kyle. Are there any questions? And Sam, I just want to make sure, are there any questions in the room?
Nope, I'm not seeing any hands.
All right, that being the case, we'll take a break, Kyle, and come back for you to continue at 7:10.
Okay, sounds great. Should I jump right in?
Go ahead, Kyle.
Okay. So before we wrap up tonight, I'm going to talk about two more topics. Briefly, consumption-based emissions, because I think it's really important and I want to make sure folks here have an understanding of these additional emission sources. And then I'll talk about our pathways model, which is the analytical underpinning for the climate emergency work plan, and which I think has some potential benefits for you as you're working on the CIP. So first, consumption-based emissions. It's a different method of looking at carbon emissions rather than sector-based. It's really trying to get a picture of that global impact of all of our consumption. And so this is a model that was developed by the Stockholm Environmental Institute for Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and we worked with DEQ to adapt that model to Multnomah County. And it uses economic data on final demand from households, governments, and businesses in certain circumstances. And it also includes our actual use phase and disposal phase emissions from Portland's sector-based emission inventory. So we bring in those emissions that are produced here into the model to really get that full picture of the life cycle emissions produced as a result of actions of our local households, governments, and businesses. I will note that the term final demand and consumers are consistent with national economic accounting, and the consumption-based inventory relies on models derived from national economic accounts to estimate emissions and is compiled from multiple sources, including the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis and the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. The model uses averages both for what Multnomah County consumers purchase and also emissions associated with producing those individual commodities. We do not have information on individual consumers, and the model does not provide data about individual producers. However, looking at this on average is still quite insightful and helps us get a sense of that overall footprint. So here, this is Portland's real carbon footprint, much larger than what I was talking about previously with our sector-based emissions. You can see the sector-based emissions there in the green and red, and the consumption-based emissions bring in all of those emissions in the blue that come from all of the things that we purchase that are produced in other parts of the world. So whether it's furniture, food, clothing, electronics, emissions are produced as a result of our consumer demand, both for production and supply chain transportation to bring those products to market here in Portland. That red sliver you see, those are our exports. So they're actually not included in our consumption-based emissions inventory, even though those emissions are produced here in Portland. And that's because they're used to satisfy demand for consumers in other communities. So they would be captured in other consumption-based inventories for other cities. And what you can see here is that those global emissions as a result of our local consumer demand are more than twice the volume of emissions we produce locally. And this really speaks to the importance of looking at life cycle emissions. This approach helps us to analyze the types of interventions that may be required from different sources. The inventory has 536 different commodities, so we can see life cycle emissions at a much more granular level, and I'll give you a kind of a snapshot of that. Here you can see that across our consumption-based emissions, 62% of those emissions come from production and supply chain transportation adds another 9%. Together, these emissions are referred to as embodied carbon. These are the emissions that when you buy a product, they're already embodied in that product. Or when you build a building, they're already embodied in those building materials. And traditionally, our climate planning has really focused on reducing use phase emissions. So the use of products, whether it's a washing machine or a car or a home heating system, right? Those are the use phase emissions, the use of those products, and are also our disposal phase emissions, which you can see are really quite small in comparison to the big picture. When looking at these emissions through a life cycle lens, it's clear that the traditional method of carbon accounting and climate planning that focus solely on use and disposal is far too limited. And it's difficult to reduce production phase emissions when most of our production is occurring outside of the city of Portland. This challenge is only heightened by increased outsourcing of manufacturing and supply chains to other countries. This requires us to use both supply and demand side interventions, influencing production supply chains where we can, and addressing the demand for those products when we can't. An example of this is Portland's new low carbon concrete procurement policy, which requires suppliers of concrete for city infrastructure projects to meet a carbon intensity standard to provide low carbon concrete for all of our projects. And this is an example of how we're changing local demand by increasing demand for low carbon concrete using our purchasing power. And I also want to note that I'm excited that PCEF is doing work to fund embodied carbon projects, and you have on the prior 2 grant rounds. And I'm excited to see where this work heads in the CIP. Here, I just wanted to show you a breakout for these different commodities. These are kind of rolled up into large buckets, but it really gives you a sense of how these life cycle emissions differ for different types of commodities. So for vehicles and parts, the top source of our emissions, you can see the bulk of those emissions are in orange, and those are use phase emissions. So that's the use of those vehicles. So using those vehicles in the city has a much greater impact than the production of those vehicles. And that's true not only for gasoline powered vehicles, but also for electric vehicles, at least today with the current carbon intensity of our grid. As you compare that to something like food and beverages, where the bulk of those emissions in purple there are production phase emissions. So producing that food is really where those emissions are coming from. So generally, you can think about products that use energy are going to have more of an impact in their use, and products like furniture and clothing and household goods and building materials are going to have that impact in their production. You can also see here how small that post-consumer disposal phase is. So our focus on waste historically as an environmental strategy is a bit misguided in that it's missing those emissions from production in purple that are really the driving primary source of those carbon emissions. So I'm going to pause here. I just want to see if anyone, before I jump into the pathway analysis, I just want to see if anyone has any questions on consumption-based emissions. And we do have that model posted on our website, so you can explore it more there if you go to the Climate Action Program under the BPS website.
Kyle,
Tracy, do you have any questions?
Nope, I don't have any questions. And just, I want to verify there are no questions in the room.
There are no questions in the room.
All right,
wow,
Kyle.
You guys are an easy group. I thought I was going to get a lot of tough questions. Feel free to bring it on. So I'm going to jump into our pathway analysis and the tool, just to give you guys a peek at kind of the analytical underpinning of the climate emergency work plan. And hopefully it'll give you some ideas for how that might inform the CIP as well. So first, the pathway tool is to understand the scale of action required to reach our adopted climate goals. The tool can help policymakers and the public visualize the various combinations of different climate strategies needed to ultimately get to net zero. And by strategies, we mean different carbon reduction activities like energy efficiency in homes or renewable electricity on the grid. The pathway tool is really a visualizer. It pulls together model outputs from 4 underlying resources. So first are just our Multnomah County greenhouse gas inventory and that historic trajectory of our emissions. And 2, for transportation, Portland Bureau of Transportation's Vision Eval model, which looks at various transportation scenarios and how those can reduce our carbon emissions over time. And then third, we have the city's, actually BPS's building analysis and projections tool. This is the tool that I mentioned earlier, where we really look at each property per square foot across the city, depending on the type of property and their energy use, and really build that up to get a big picture of our buildings emissions, where we can really actually then break out multifamily and rental properties. So this is a tool that might be of interest to PCEF team. And then lastly, we have the iTree tool, which was developed by the U.S. Forest Service that looks at carbon sequestration potential from forest carbon storage. So really pretty narrowly on tree planting rather than the other strategies that certainly PCEF is funding, like regenerative agriculture. So I just want to note, Pathways estimates emission reductions for various strategies, but is not prescriptive in precisely which actions are taken and how those actions will be compliant to reach adopted targets. These details will be determined through future policy and program development processes over the coming years. The Pathways Visualizer allows users, whether it's city employees or the general public, to see various strategies in context of our total emissions and how they stack up to get us to those targets for 2030 and 2050. For example, in the tool, you can scale electrification of homes from 0% electrified up to 100% electrified. So you can see kind of the level of electrification that would be needed in combinations with other strategies to hit our adopted targets. There are limitations to this model. I mean, first I'll just note it was built in 2020. The underlying resources were built prior to that. So there are some improvements that have been made since then, or new policies that have been passed that aren't fully accounted for in the tool. We had to scale some of those models up to the county level. For instance, our buildings tool really only looks at City of Portland buildings, so we had to make some assumptions about that and scale that to the county level. It uses different emission factors than our sector-based emissions. It looks at the direct emissions from PGE and Pacific Power. It only looks at 3 years. So 2017 was our base year for the model. And then it looks at 2030 and 2050. And you'll see as I show you the graphic from the Pathway tool that it really aligns with those 3 points. And I'll note that when we get there. It also does not look at industrial sector emissions, waste emissions, or fugitive emissions, although they are included in the model. We don't have underlying models that look at how that can be reduced. Now, there are tools to do that, and that's something that we may look at as we expand this tool in the coming years. I'll also note that there was limited EV adoption in Vision Eval. So we really had to take electrification of vehicles much further in order for us to get to zero. And there are limitations in the interactivity between the strategies. For example, there's a separate transportation model from the buildings and energy model. So it's not accounting for load growth from electric vehicles, for example. So I just want to note that there are some limitations here. It's not a perfect tool, but it has really been insightful for us to put together our climate priorities. So this is what the Pathway kind of graphic looks. This is just the baseline reductions that are built in. The gray area are carbon emissions that are produced between 2020 and 2050. That dashed yellow line is the adopted targets, 50% reduction in 2030, and again, 100% in 2050. So you can see that bend in the curve there at 2030. That's because the model really looks at the base year, 2030 and 2050, and we don't have that granularity between those dates. It's pretty simplified in that regard. One thing that's quite different than what we've projected in the past is our business as usual scenario actually achieves a 39% reduction by 2030 and a 48% reduction by 2050. So certainly not far enough to get to our adopted targets, but in prior climate plans, we have forecasted emission increases without further action. But due to adopted state and federal policies, we're now actually seeing significant benefits here locally. Obviously, we need to go much further, and that's where local action is really critical if we really want to get to that 2050 target. I'm going to take a minute just to kind of go through each of the wedges. This is the graphic now. I've got all the different strategies turned on. You can see how they stack up. Again, it's a dynamic tool, so you can adjust each of these individual strategies to make them bigger or larger or start sooner or later. But I'm going to give you a run through of what's in here just so you have a quick sense of what's included. So again, the building baseline is a big chunk there. The building's emissions are all in blue. And we can see here we've got residential energy efficiency, commercial energy efficiency, new construction energy codes, so advanced energy codes for new construction, and renewable electricity on the grid, and renewable natural gas displacing up to 30% of our natural gas. We did not go any further with renewable natural gas based on the technical potential. A residential electrification of existing homes, commercial electrification of existing buildings, and natural gas in new construction. That's whether or not there is gas in new construction. So that's a way to explore whether or not there's value in a ban on natural gas. Here we have industrial innovation. As I noted earlier, the model does not look at industrial sector emissions with the exception of electricity, which is addressed in that renewable electricity wedge. So this wedge is just kind of a carve out for those remaining industrial emissions and speaks to some of the work that we prioritized in our climate emergency work plan around creating a clean industry hub that'll be an innovation space to work collaboratively across industries to look at how we reduce carbon emissions, energy use, and material waste while advancing a circular economy. So this is a really exciting new project that's we're in the research phase on. We have a study that's underway right now. So we don't have answers today on how we get that to net zero, but it is a wedge there. So you can see how big of a component it is. The orange colored actions, here you can see our transportation baseline and then the other transportation scenarios. So this transportation policy scenario is a big wedge here. And so I think it bears discussing briefly. This was developed by the Bureau of Transportation, and it's a significant bundle of actions. So it's not one strategy, but it includes a mix of road and parking pricing strategies, so increasing parking costs and road pricing as well. 2, a reduction in fuel carbon intensity from the State Clean Fuels Program. 3, transportation demand management, like operational improvements to the transportation system, traffic and signal management. And then 4, strategic electrification of high value sources like e-bikes, increasing percentage of passenger and goods delivered by electric vehicles, and increasing electric vehicle chargers and heavy truck electrification. So quite a bit rolled into that. PBOT has committed to implementing that bundle of actions by 2030. So that will have a significant impact in helping to reduce our transportation sector emissions. But it certainly isn't enough. So we had to build on top of that. How do we get the remaining gasoline out of our system? How do we get the remaining diesel out of the system as well? So there you can see that orange wedge is replacing gasoline with renewables, essentially through a clean electric grid and electric vehicles. And that darker, almost brown color there is replacing diesel fuel with renewable fuels. And that is something that Portland City Council just adopted last week. The renewable fuel standard will replace the sale of fossil diesel fuel with renewable fuels in the city of Portland by 2030. And the last wedge there is really important. And that's because we don't have a way to kind of reduce some of our carbon emission sources. For instance, landfill waste is something I talked about before. Short of capping our landfills and be able to fully capture that methane, we're not able to reduce those emissions. Similarly, with wastewater treatment, we have large ponds, and those create fugitive emissions that rise off those ponds. And without capping that entire system and somehow capturing that gas, we're still going to have emissions from wastewater treatment. Similarly, with fugitive emissions today, we don't have mechanisms to reduce all of those fugitive emissions. I discussed those a bit earlier. So forest carbon storage helps us make up for that remaining amount of carbon emissions, and we can't get to net zero without carbon sequestration or some kind of negative carbon technology to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And this is also true in that we expect to see some use of natural gas as we get out to 2050, maybe helping to balance renewable loads on the electricity grid or in some unique applications in the industrial sector. And that again will need to be addressed through some kind of sequestration or negative carbon technology. So the cumulative effect of these strategies is not simply a sum of its parts. There are synergies between doing all these things together. For instance, renewable electricity with electrifications of buildings. So this tool is really valuable because it helps us see how we get to those targets and what it's going to take to stack up to reach those goals. Really briefly, the tool also has action metrics. So as you're scaling the various strategies, we can see what that means in terms of number of low-income homes that need energy efficiency retrofits or electrification, renters versus owner-occupied housing that needs those kind of retrofits, the number of units for people of color within the city that need to be upgraded, average costs of retrofits for low-income households, average vehicle trips that need to be avoided. So these action metrics help provide some context to the data so that you can potentially use those to set targets in the context of those strategies and the goals that we're trying to achieve. I will note that that level of sequestration that I showed in green is really significant. It's planting 99,000 acres of forest land in Multnomah County. And that's based on the findings from the iTree tool. So it's a really significant lift to achieve that level of sequestration. So really briefly, I just want to show a couple scenarios just so you guys get a sense of how the model is dynamic. So this is a low action scenario that actually hits our targets. And I want you, as I'm flipping through these, to pay attention to the gray area in the bottom left of the slide. Again, those are our carbon emissions that we're producing between now and 2050. And so you can see as we accelerate our climate action by taking more aggressive action earlier, we really reduce those cumulative emissions. The high action scenario, this is actually the scenario we published in the Climate Emergency Work Plan, or a maximum action scenario, you can see that gray area is significantly smaller. And what the climate scientists and the IPCC is telling us is that we really need to accelerate climate action and get more earlier reductions. And this is to address that effect of those cumulative emissions. So the more that we can do now, before 2030, the better. And that's why we've set the Climate Emergency Work Plan scenario to achieve a 60% reduction by 2030, rather than the adopted target, which is 2050. Or I'm sorry, adopted target is 50% by 2030. This is the graphic that we published in the Climate Emergency Work Plan. It obviously looks different than what I just showed you. So I just want to take a moment to show you how we did that translation. Here is the pathways chart that I showed you previously, that high action scenario reformatted to align with this graphic. And you can see that the colored wedges on this are the reductions. The gray area are the remaining emissions. When we look at this graphic, you've got the reductions in gray and you've got the remaining additions in color. So our intent here was to show those remaining additions by sector, so folks could get a sense of that, as it was more intuitive for the general user. First, I want to note the dotted area at the top is, again, our business as usual reductions that we're forecasting. Second, as mentioned, this is just one possible scenario, the high action scenario. So there are other ways to get to net zero besides what we're forecasting here. The gray area in the middle are those reductions modeled in the Pathways tool. And those color wedges, again, are those remaining cumulative emissions over time reaching net zero in 2050. And I have two really key takeaways from this analysis that I want to share with you. First, it is possible to achieve the adopted targets with the tools and strategies that we have available to us today. So as you saw what I was going through in those strategies, there's nothing in there that we don't fully understand and don't have available to us at our disposal. Second, there's no silver bullet. No single strategy or action will get us to net zero. Most of the reduction strategies we looked at achieved less than a 5% reduction by 2050. So you saw all those really skinny little wedges in there. That is because it's going to take the cumulative and interactive effect of stacking up all these strategies together to get us to our goals. So bottom line, we have to do everything. There's no shortcuts. The climate emergency work plan lays out a set of priority actions for council and our community to consider over the next 3 years that put us on this path to hitting these targets. The pathway analysis helped to illuminate the most critical carbon reduction strategies that have the greatest impact on reducing emissions. So we looked at 100% renewable electricity with achieving 80% by 2030 and 100% by 2040. That 80% by 2030 is essentially PGE getting to 100% renewable. We also included that Portland preferred transportation scenario by 2030, a significant bundle of work around electric vehicles, the RFS passing, which happened last week, and then the industrial innovation work that I highlighted for you earlier through our Clean Industry Hub. So you can see why we chose to prioritize launching these strategies in the climate emergency work plan over the next 3 years. As I noted earlier, we still need to complete all the other strategies in order to achieve these targets, but we see these initial big moves that the city needs to make to get us on track, particularly around electricity supply and transportation. Also note, because I'm sure some of you are interested in those building reductions by 2030, we looked at 15% reduction in emissions from energy efficiency by 2030 from residential and commercial buildings, and 10% electrification of all existing residential and commercial buildings. So with that, I'm going to wrap up here. I do want to note that the Pathways tool is on our website, and I'm happy to do deeper dives on this tool, but you can also go onto the website, download the tool, and play with it yourself. I think there's some of the analysis here could be valuable as you're moving forward with your CIP process. So again, thank you very much for having me tonight. Excited to share my work, and I hope that you find that meaningful and helpful as you're moving forward on your process. So I will pause and see if we do have any questions, and I'm happy to take those.
Michael?
Hi, I had 2 questions. My first question is between private investment, community investment, government investment. Do you guys have a ballpark figure of what it takes for a dollar investment to meet the 2030 goal of 50 or 60%? And my second question is, how are you planning on offsetting the increasing cost of transportation for working class and poor folks?
Great questions. So the answer to your first question is no, we have not quantified the cost associated with hitting these targets. And that's largely because the model itself isn't that prescriptive. So for example, how do we achieve that electrification in buildings? It doesn't prescribe the pathway to getting there. So we aren't able to really fully understand the costs associated with that. Some of those action metrics in the tool do get at cost. So you can play around with that and explore that for certain strategies, particularly around low-income households. We tried to do our best to quantify those specific costs, but we haven't looked at the overall cost of hitting that target. On your second question, I will point to POEM, the work of the Portland Bureau of Transportation. They convened a committee to look at pricing for equitable mobility. So the whole focus of that committee was how do we do transportation pricing in a way that obviously will increase the cost of transportation, but we're doing it in a way that's equitable, so we're returning those dollars to the communities that are least able to afford those cost increases. So that is absolutely part of the work that PBOT is doing. And they've republished a report on their website that is the summary of the findings and recommendations from that committee that's really informing how they're moving forward with their pricing strategies.
Maria, and then Megan.
Sure, thanks. Thanks for your presentation. I found so much of this material really helpful and informative. it's clear that the city and the county have to make these great strides in addressing the transportation sector, which is the sector that I work in. And in the spirit of trying to unpack all of this technical material in this PCEF space so that we can relay information to our community members, can you talk about the institutional barriers and name the key people, agencies, and institutions outside of PCEF in this region that have the greatest influence on real transformation? I think we see like all the sources of carbon, and we see like where these sectors are doing well and where they're not, but I think it would help for our community members and for me to know who the actors are. Like, does decarbonization just happen through PCEF and overnight? But, can you name some institutions we could be more familiar with, or agencies who we should push this charge to as well?
Yeah, great question. Obviously, for the building sector and our grid, Energy Trust of Oregon is really key in helping achieve those reductions. And they've been very successful in increasing energy efficiency and renewables through their programs. Doesn't quite go far enough, so there's a really important role for PCEF in helping take that further. We're seeing a ton of money coming down from the federal government through the infrastructure and other bills that were just passed in the last year. So those investments and how we prioritize those will be a big part of that puzzle. For transportation, there's really a network between our Transportation Bureau, the work that Metro is doing on transportation at a regional level, and of course ODOT as well. And these organizations are well coordinated around transportation, but none of them really have dollars to help community members hit those targets. So while they're looking at the big infrastructure changes and the policy moves, we really hitting these targets requires all of us as Portlanders to start to change our behavior and our practices. And that's a bit beyond what those transportation agencies are looking at. So there's a really critical role there for community to support each other in how we get to those goals. And I think the dollars that PCEF will be investing in transportation will be really important for that. And of course, the dollars coming down from the federal government to help make some of those infrastructure changes as well. Hopefully we'll see really much better incentives available for electric vehicles from the state and federal government in the coming years. That will really help as well. But I think that you're hitting on one of the reasons why transportation emissions have been so hard to reduce. We just don't have any one entity that is solely focused on driving those emissions down and providing resources to folks to help do that. So while we've got a network between TriMet and our other transportation agencies, it's just not enough to get to net zero. So I think it's going to be a combination of government policy, government investment, and community action. We're not going to get to zero without really community leadership and helping to help us reach these targets. Government can't do it alone.
Thanks. Yes, I might push back on some of that, knowing that the state does have resources, knowing how they've invested in certain areas and not in others. But you're right. It does depend on lots of people being more coordinated, but also in line with how funding should be spent, whether it's gas tax or other ways that they've been able to generate revenue. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. You are right about that.
Megan?
Yeah, I have a question. Well, I have a question to follow up on that, but I'll start with the first one, which actually links to like the part 2 of your presentation on consumption-based inventory. When you came and presented to us a few years ago, you really made a stark statement about how high-income households really consume a lot more and produce a lot more greenhouse gas emissions. And to me, that seems really important for us at PCEF to consider. So I'm just curious if you have an update to that data from last time.
I do not, because we haven't updated that model since I presented to you, mostly just because of the pandemic. But we will be working on that soon. You are right that there are the much higher consumption from higher income households. I like to think of this, often if you think about a higher income household, they're probably going to have a larger square foot home. That means more energy use, more carpet, more building materials, more furniture, more lighting, probably more electronics. They're probably more likely to take more air travel, all of these kinds of things. So that is something that I think we really need to do our work on reducing consumption-based emissions with that lens and understanding that it is not our low-income community that is driving those emissions. It's really coming from mid and high-income households. But I don't have new data to share on that, sorry.
Yeah, just thinking about that for PCEF, I mean, we fund projects that help frontline communities adapt to the problems caused by high-income households around the world and in the US and in Portland. But so, while I want to see that data, like, our role is not to help. I don't think our role at PCEF is necessarily helping high-income households reduce their consumption. That should come from regulation and other things. But so just thinking about the PCEF specific role in the climate strategy. So so when you do have that updated data, I think that would be a really important conversation point for PCEF.
Glad to share that with you guys. I will note though, some of the work that you've already funded around embodied carbon is really in building sector. So that new construction buildings and how we reduce the carbon intensity of that building, the embodied carbon in the building. And, that does have the ability to benefit lower income households as well, if we're talking about multifamily buildings and or low income housing. So there is a connection there, particularly in the building sector. We could probably find other places where there are connections.
Yeah, I'd love for you to come back and kind of unpack that more. I have two more comments. A second one is you talked about the carbon intensity of the grid and how that's going to take a while to come down. And I just wanted to comment, I guess, to our PCEF staff and committee members. Maria probably has thoughts about this, kind of building on the transportation comments. To me, when I hear a lot of this, I think it's very obvious to me that with our very limited PCEF dollars when it comes to transportation, I mean, we're talking 60 to 70 million over 5 years. It's not a lot of money when I know what transportation dollars cost. I think it's not investing in EVs that much. It's maybe more in bike, walking infrastructure and in land use changes to support what's like essentially free and low cost transportation for people, and ones that don't have a dependence on a grid that PCEF has no control over, whether, the fossil fuel mix in it, but we know biking and walking are essentially fossil fuel free interventions, and land use mixes, helping more people live close to. So anyway, that's a thought, but we haven't talked a lot about transportation as a committee at all, so we'll have to revisit that, I think. But I want to see less focus on EV in general in the world, and more on land use and alternative, not alternative, just the way humans have gotten around until the last 100 years or so. So I would like PCEF to really prioritize that rather than the shift to EV. I do think there's a role for e-bikes because that promotes an accessibility that people don't have in a relatively large, sprawling city. And my last one is, I think a lot about green infrastructure, regenerative ag, and the tree planting side of PCEF, because that's one of my roles on the committee. And you mentioned, and I think mainly where that fits in today is the sequestration side of things. And you talked about how, we're talking to really achieve those sequestration goals, which are critical. We need 99, whatever you said, trees, a lot of trees. And I just was curious if there's been any look to see about could Portland, how much of Portland how many trees can be planted in Portland relative to that need? And then does regenerative agriculture play a role inside Portland and outside? And then what about green infrastructure like green roofs, de-paving, things like that? So, which I think can all play into that carbon sequestration pathway.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we don't have a model that looks at those benefits for eco roofs and regenerative ag. So we can only look at tree planting, but that is exactly what the iTree tool looks at, the available open space for tree planting within Multnomah County. So that was the exact purpose of that tool. But certainly we're going to need other sources of sequestration, and I love the work that you've been doing on that.
All right, thank you, Megan. And Kyle, thank you for your presentation and it was really informative. So thank you very much. And now we're going to do a little adjustment on the agenda.
Tracy, I
The
realized
climate investment.
it looks like we had one lingering question in the group, and I did not catch that. Robin.
Okay, I'll try.
I'm
Let me just make this quick. Ton of data, tons of models. Thank you. Considering that we're about to develop a 5-year climate investment plan, based upon you're living in all the numbers, where would you prioritize things? And I know this is a loaded question, but what's the biggest bang for the buck?
I think it's important for me to leave that question to you guys. I don't have the line of sight into the work you're doing. I've had conversations with the PCEF team in helping to inform the work that you're doing already. So I think that the allocations that have been made in what went to City Council and was adopted, I think are starting to align in those areas. But in terms of the specific strategies, I'm not prepared to weigh in on that tonight, sorry.
You sound like a politician.
Well, yeah, bureaucrat.
All right, Kyle, again, thank you. And we're going to make an adjustment to the agenda. The Climate Investment Plan Funding Initiative template, that will be emailed to committee members, and we'll have discussion on that later. And as you can see from the what's up on the screen right now, we're going to move to regulated multifamily affordable housing.
Okay. So apologies to James, to come all the way over from Northeast. But I just wanted to acknowledge a couple, Wendy Kelfkin, who is our Clean Energy Project Manager, joined us and is in the room now too. And also Jill Chen, who is with the Portland Housing Bureau, is also with us. And so Jill's going to be available mostly for, questions and answers, and so that you all have a friendly face to get familiar with at the Housing Bureau. So I'm going to start with and I'm going to try and scream through these. And also just for those in the room and online, feel free to stand up. It is late and we've all been sitting, if that would be helpful for you, because there's going to be a whole bunch more numbers in these slides as well. So this is kind of the state of housing. There are about 270,000 households in Portland, slightly more, about 52% owner occupied and 48% are renter occupied. There's an estimated deficit of 25,000 affordable housing units, so single family and multifamily, just some sort of units. And renters are disproportionately lower income and disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The median income for homeowners in Portland is a little over $100,000, and for renters, less than half of that. So that's the median household income for that 48% of households in Portland. It's just a pretty stark difference there. Renters by race, about 43% of white households are renters. About 70% of Black households in Portland are renters. There's a range there, 50 to 60% of Indigenous households are renters, and a little over half of kind of what are other communities of color are also renters. And then this is just the sort of point in time count that happens every year for the houseless community. There are a little over 5,000 people unhoused in January 2022 in Multnomah County. Next slide. Oh, the colors on this look a little different than they do on my screen, but this is just a graph that shows affordability. So a home or a household is considered cost burdened if 30 to 50% of their income goes toward their housing costs. So that's their rent and their utilities. They're considered severely cost burdened if 50% or more of their total income goes to housing costs. So you can see that within not surprisingly, given the difference in median household income, there is a much greater share of households that are renting that are both severely and kind of the slightly less cost burden, so more than half. And it's less for homeowners. About 27% of homeowners are considered cost burden, and just 10%, or maybe not just, I don't want to say just 10%, but 10% cost burden, so a little less. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is pretty specific, and I wish that this spelled an acronym that could be a word or had another way to say it, but I'm going to end up saying regulated multifamily affordable housing a bunch of times, and because that's what we're talking about. So the Portland Housing Bureau currently regulates about 15,000 affordable rental housing units in the city. That's about 70% of all regulated units within the city, and it makes up about 11% of the total rental market in the city. So just to give you a sense of kind of where the Portland House, kind of how the Portland Housing Bureau sits within the market. These are, the next bullet just shows sort of current local funders and funding. The Portland bond and the Metro bond, those are really pretty significant influxes of funding for the production and sort of major renovation of affordable housing units. Affordable housing doesn't see a steady same kind of steady annual funding streams. It's very lumpy. You might see sort of like big bonds pass, like the Portland bond and the Metro bond, and then you're able to put a bunch of units onto the market, and then there will historically has been a little bit of a trough after that. And then there's tax increment, the TIF funds and federal funds like CDBG and HOME. Those are much smaller than and the CDBG and HOME funds are annual, but they are much smaller. I think Jill estimated about 5 to 8 million per year for production. Portland Housing Bureau does have a green building standard that sets goals for energy use. And just to note that the clean energy measures are often value engineered out of projects in order to maintain the number of units that are required to be brought onto market. Next slide. So clean energy in this space. We got the directive, sort of Sam mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, he kind of showed that diagram that's had all of the other categories that we're going to be developing programs around, sort of designing programs around and initiatives around within the climate investment plan. And then there were those two different ones that council already approved. There's the equitable tree canopy, and then the 60 million to increase clean energy in regulated multifamily affordable housing. The benefit is that the initiative will deliver reduced energy usage and cost and improve resiliency, comfort, and health for hundreds of households with low income. There is a little bit less direct financial benefit because of the way that rents are set in regulated affordable housing, but there are all of these other, these are the other benefits associated with this investment. We are partnering with our city partners at the Portland Housing Bureau and using a phased approach to enable measures in projects that are currently well into their development while allowing time for more stakeholder and community engagement related to future projects. And so when I was talking about the kind of those bonds, the Portland bond and the Metro bond, and those being a really big influx of funding, those were passed in 2018, and developers and affordable housing providers have been working to kind of working with Portland Housing Bureau to help bring those projects to fruition. And some of them are well into their development process. And so they are past the point at which we could do certain interventions, and they can't, they're a ship that's heading in a certain direction. They can change course a little and they can add improvements, but they really are beyond the stage where we can kind of intervene in the early design. Next slide. I'm just going to leave this up here for a second, and we're going to send it out to everyone. I don't think, we put it up here because I wanted to give a sense of kind of what the known projects are that may close within the phase one timeframe. And what we're thinking about for the phase one timeframe is everything that has a targeted financial closing date within the next 12 months or within 12 months of when we define what phase two is. Once we define what phase two is, if we're a year out from financial closing, then that may, that gives the developers and the designers time to potentially adjust their designs, adjust their permits, and more significantly, change their projects. Oh, yeah. So thank you, Sam. There are 3 projects in there that are bold. There's the Tistillal Village, Garden Park, and Albina 1. These projects were actually all awarded funding through our RFP 2. Tistillal Village was awarded $1.8 million. Albina 1 was awarded $1.7 million, and Garden Park $1.6 million for energy efficiency. And I don't know if there's any renewable energy in there, actually. I think maybe just for clean energy measures. So this body of work, these known projects that may close in the phase one timeframe, represent about $550 million in total cost. And so you'll see on the next slide that these are known projects that may close after the phase one timeframe. So they're a little bit earlier in their development. So there's sort of more opportunity if we can define what our phase one requirements are and what our phase one eligible expenses are to move these projects to be even more carbon, like to reduce even more carbon and to have potentially other requirements that might require some more earlier consideration by their developers. These projects have estimated total costs of about $411 million. And so between the two, that's like about 55% of total costs up in phase one and about 45% in phase two. If we're thinking about kind of the projects that we know are going to be developed that are regulated multifamily affordable within sort of the CIP timeframe. And maybe just it's worth noting that, that it does add, if you can go back one slide, Sam, that in this first phase, it's adding nearly 1,000 total new regulated affordable housing units. So, and in the second phase, just about 800. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I'm almost done, and then we can have questions, if there are any. So these are the kind of phase one characteristics that we have been engaging with Portland Housing Bureau. We've been engaging with developers, affordable housing developers, affordable housing providers, and sort of technical experts from the building energy world in thinking about how to best get clean energy measures into projects that are well underway already. So the eligible expenses that we're looking to fund are the costs above their current design for each project for high efficiency water heating, space conditioning, and ventilation. And noting that these are the areas that we could kind of consider high priority. And by space conditioning, I mean heating and cooling. And then so that would be paying for the delta between how the project is currently designed, which are generally above energy code already, and whatever sort of additional high efficiency measures they might be able to implement. And then full cost for solar storage, and for electric vehicle charging. The total award for any individual project would be capped at 10% of hard construction cost. In phase one, it's highly it's unlikely that all of the projects would be able to find that many clean energy measures that would be approved, but it's possible. And so that's where that 10% cap comes from. So I mentioned before that in phase one, that represents about $550 million in total project costs. About 75% of that is hard construction cost. So if you get math, if you multiply that by 0.75 times 0.1, you do end up, if everybody got up to 10%, we wouldn't have enough money between phase one and phase two. Although not too, I mean, we would be maybe, I think about, don't have it in front of me, but I think about 13 million over. The requirements for this phase one are PHB, are going with the Portland Housing Bureau workforce and contractor equity requirements, the Portland Housing Bureau reporting requirements, with the addition of energy use of a requirement related to energy use modeling and post-construction verification of clean energy measures. Oversight and monitoring, PCEF will review and approve each of the proposed clean energy expenses from each of the projects in phase one, and PHB will provide oversight and monitoring to assure compliance. Next slide. So in phase two, sort of the primary considerations are that we'll be evaluating, and there's a lot within each of these bullets. This is an attempt at a less wordy slide. But the sort of considerations related to eligible expenses and how can we design a program that really drives multifamily affordable housing to net zero. Evaluating project selection, and then requirements, and under requirements would be sort of looking at both reporting requirements and workforce equity requirements. The stakeholder engagement that will happen related to phase two will include affordable housing providers, developers, contractors, subcontractors, tenant advocates, other funders, outside of Portland Housing Bureau and outside of PCEF, and then again, continuing to also engage with technical experts and energy engineers, architects, those sorts of folks. So obviously these are just 3 prompts and, and sort of questions for you to be able to, but obviously you're free to ask whatever questions you want to, but the prompts are, are there any questions or feedbacks on phase one? And we can definitely go back to that slide. Are there opportunities or challenges that should be considered that you sort of would like to elevate for our consideration for phase two? And what priorities should be elevated in thinking about the phase two program design?
Katie, so you're now opening up for questions?
I am.
Is there anyone in the room who has questions for you? I don't see anyone so far online.
Oh, it looks like Robin and maybe Maria, did you have your hand up as well? Okay.
All right, Robin.
Thanks for sharing that. I think it seems like some pretty detailed thoughts have been given into what are eligible expenses or investments, and I'm just kind of curious, to what degree or to what extent are you going to engage community in terms of refining or defining eligible expenses or some of the plans that you just talked about?
For the phase one projects, our intention, we really are working on a timeline with the first financial closing the first of those projects having financial closing in January, of trying to get an intergovernmental agreement in place with PHB so that we can move things in January. So to be honest, there's not a lot of additional community engagement that is kind of conceptualized around these projects, which are already pretty far along in their development and their design, and there's not really a ton of opportunity to change what those projects look like. And so with that in mind, our intention was to do what we can to increase the comfort and reduce the carbon in those units. You know, we have engaged developers, affordable housing providers, and technical experts, but to your point, we have not so much the community. Jill can probably speak to engagement related to those projects before we got here.
Yeah, thank you, Katie, and great to see you again, Robin. In all of the projects that PHB funds for affordable housing, there's a multiple processes. So before developers are even awarded the funds, they go through a process whereby a community review committee has to review their project and actually select them to be awarded. In addition, for any real estate development that is in an affordable housing, we require the developer to do a number of, you can call it community engagement and outreach with the neighborhood associations, as well as with trying to ensure that the population they're trying to serve will be served, and that the design, the charrettes meet the needs of that particular population. So each of the projects you see that was in Katie's presentation have already gone through a lot of that. And as Katie mentioned, because of the time between a project being selected and going into financial close, it means it has already gone through, say, design review as well as a permitting process. So in the city of Portland, permitting takes over a year. So this has gone through a huge engagement and sort of both city of Portland process as well as community process. So I hope that helps clarify a little bit.
Yeah, it helps. I think, you know, what kind of drew that question is I look at EV charging and kind of what Megan mentioned earlier. You know, is that a priority for people living in affordable housing? You know, the average cost of an EV is, you know, significant. And I don't know the answer to that question. I'm just kind of bringing it up. And maybe it is. I just don't know.
It's a requirement in all of the buildings to be EV ready.
So then
in most of these buildings, you will not have EV charging unless an entity like PCEF was there. For example, we have had multiple discussions with different participants, developers, as well as stakeholders, asking for maybe shared vehicles and such, but that's not part of the scope right now. So EV charging, you're right, it's not that folks who are going to be in low-income housing will have multiple electric cars. That's not necessarily the case. It is the case that we are required to provide to be EV ready.
And I guess,
so if the station is there, then it could be made.
I guess if it is required, then why is PCEF funding it? And that's a broader question. I'll just leave it out there. I think, and if it's required, it should be part of the overall construction budget for the property.
We are trying to make sure. That's why we are looking at how could you provide a whole EV. This is not. We're asking our developers to do more than what is code. So in order to propose and push the PCEF goals, we're asking our developers to go above code.
And maybe just a clarification, I think the requirement is that they be EV ready, in the same way that the roofs have to be solar ready, but there's not a requirement that there be electric vehicle charging available. Like that infrastructure doesn't have to be installed, just like the panels don't have to go on the roofs, but the roofs have to be solar ready. I think, Robin, it's a good question, and around kind of, do people want, you know, EV, do people have EVs, do people want EVs, and there's a lot of work around that. I think that we have seen interest in some of, you know, the affordable housing providers that we have in our applicant pool already around car sharing, and also a lot of interest with one of our grantees, Metropolitan Family Services, in getting lower income households into electric vehicles as a way of lowering costs. Lower income households tend to live more miles away from the places where they work and have sort of, the constraints of more budget and time constraints. So EVs are seen as a kind of a good way to do that. But I hear what you're saying. I think that there might be some additional information. There might be some additional information in some like surveys that have been done in Portland that we could send out afterwards and maybe post online. I know that of at least a couple.
Okay, and then just one last comment is I think I would encourage to the extent that for phase 2, I know phase 1 is a tight timeline, but for phase 2, let's see what we can do to get some community engagement and feedback in terms of phase 2 projects or priorities. Thank you.
Thank you,
Maria?
Thanks. To build off of some of those vehicle-oriented questions, can you clarify or confirm if parking minimum requirements are eliminated from these developments in progress right now, and just to think about what vehicular accommodation looks like at these properties?
Sure. The vehicle parking, it depends on the particular project. In a number of them, for example, the first project, Alder 9, it's actually in Central East Side, so it had no parking. That's part of the reason we do want things such as the availability of, say, shared vehicles or shared bikes, potentially, because low-income folks do require, usually many of them have to travel longer and more frequently because they have multiple jobs. So it really depends on the project. What we've seen is that as you go further outside of the city core, even when parking is not required, our affordable housing developers have put up parking because especially for families and family-sized buildings. So you'll see, for example, there's one on 74th and Gleason, that's family. There is going to be some parking. However, there's some other ones, for example, Hollywood Hub that's on there is next to the Hollywood Max line. Obviously, it should not need much parking. So it really depends on the project.
Thank you. That's the answer I was looking for. My other question, I think maybe for Katie, but I see the oversight and monitoring category here. It says that PCEF will review and approve. Can you clarify, is that like PCEF staff or PCEF staff and committee as like a collaborative exercise?
I think it would be PCEF staff looking at the particular measures that are being proposed for each specific project. And the oversight and monitoring, I mean, Portland Housing Bureau has, a team of kind of senior construction managers that include architects and folks that are deep in the weeds on these projects already because because they have PHB funding in them. And so we'll be, working in collaboration with them to, fully understand the measures that are being proposed and working with our contractors to ensure that there's some third-party oversight on the energy modeling to make sure that we're getting the GHG reductions that we hope to get out of the proposed measures.
All right, we'll have Faith, if you go, and then Faith after you, Megan, if you can just jump in with your question.
So thanks very much. Really nice to meet you, Jill. And thank you, Katie, for an excellent presentation. You got a lot of information out in a really succinct way, so I appreciate that. And I also appreciate the really tight walk that this is, I think, for many. There's many considerations as this feels a tight walk on, and particularly the timeline. And I really appreciate, though I find a struggle in it, I really, really appreciate the fact that we're trying to get money into these brand new units that will be on the market for 100 years, right? And now is the time to make that investment. So if we have an opportunity to improve the quality of these homes, now's the time to do it. So awesome that we have this opportunity. I'm wondering if it would be helpful. It would be helpful for me, and I'm wondering if it would be helpful for the rest of the committee to actually think about in some of these projects that are coming up in phase one, particularly the ones that are coming right up. I mean, I'm assuming we've already looked at what's possible to add to these, and I'm wondering if you can just give some examples. I'm assuming that it's solar and EV, but I'm curious about what is possible to add to a scope on something that's closing in January, for example.
Katie, you want me to take that?
Yeah, that would be great.
For example, in the Older 9 case, that's closing in January. It is a high-rise building. It is targeted for intergenerational living. There's also some units that are for homeless individuals and homeless households. However, because it's a high-rise, we right now in the city do not require any air conditioning. But because it's intergenerational, we want to make sure that the seniors who are going to be in there, who are vulnerable, plus the kids who are vulnerable as well, do not necessarily, especially as you go towards the higher floors, you have some kind of cooling strategy. The cheapest way to do cooling is a mobile air conditioning unit. You know, plop it in, plop it out. It's cheap. You get a port. I wouldn't say it's cheap. It's a few $100s per unit. Mm-hmm. A much more efficient and effective cooling strategy is probably mini splits. Mm-hmm. In this particular case, the developer has proposed mini splits, not necessarily on all the units, but certainly on the upper floors, because that's where the highest at risk, you can call it, units are. So those are some of the things where we are looking and working with the developer saying, can you provide this? Because it is a lot more efficient and frankly, in some cases better for the building as well as the residents. Does that help?
Certainly, I agree with the scope change for sure and the ambition on that. I just am so curious whether that's possible when you have contractors hired, permits pulled, construction drawings done, financial closing imminent.
Yeah, they have told us that if we PHB and PCEF, come up with an agreement, they need to order all of this by March. Yeah. So it's a go or no go. And if we don't have an agreement, for example, the Older 9 opportunity will disappear.
And how, can you give an example of just maybe one other type of building that one seems
maybe?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Faith,
or Katie, no, that's fine too.
I want to make sure that we leave a few minutes for Robin to give an update on a conference that he just attended at the end of this meeting, but we can certainly follow up with some of those examples. I guess the only thing I would just add is that we have, and Jill more than us really, I mean, has been hearing like wanting to know what's eligible also. I mean, there are things that people know they want to do, and then there are things that they're like, well, we're not really going to think about it unless we kind of know what's possible. So, Megan, I know you have questions, and I'm hoping maybe you can just ask them and we can follow up with answers so that we can give Robin a few minutes here at the end of the meeting before we close out.
Totally. And Faith asked the question I already had, which was, it'd be really great if you could send us example projects, because that just makes this more concrete, and I think the public will want to know that too. And then I was just curious on that slide that shows PHB wage and contractor and how that compares to PCEF, so we know what the trade-off, if there's a difference there. I understand why PHB would have to use its own, but I was just curious. I feel like Randfeast would be very curious about that one too. And then on the oversight and monitoring, I just wanted to understand, does that mean our program metric, like to our program metrics? And I hope it at least does at least some point. And then also this whole word of compliance, I was like, does this include asking the residents if they're happy and like how they're using it and like the energy usage? So I was just wanting to understand all that part, but you can totally follow up with me about all that.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
All right, well, Robin, you're next.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to abbreviate this so that we can end on time. So over the next 10 years, an unprecedented amount of public funds will be deployed to address climate action, both here in Portland, Oregon, and the states. And with the onset of our 5-year climate investment plan that we're working on, I started doing some research to see how IRA funds, the Inflation Reduction Act, could complement PCEF funds. And last week, I attended with James the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy, or ACEEE, conference in Washington, D.C., to learn about the latest plans and updates and timelines around the Inflation Reduction Act. And while in D.C., we also had the opportunity to meet with Washington, D.C.'s Office of Energy and Environment, the Coalition for Green Capital, Green Alternatives, and the World Resources Institute to kind of just share ideas and information with each other. And I just wanted to kind of highlight some of the observations, conversations that we had when we were out there. Let me start with just an overview of the IRA. The IRA appropriates about $147 billion over the next 10 years to support about 100 climate programs across 16 federal agencies. It's a lot. And there are also 16 climate-related federal tax credits that were created, expanded, or extended as part of the IRA. And of that, 11 programs, $24 billion, and 3 tax credits focus on climate justice, which represents the potential overlap with PCEF. $24 billion is still a lot of money, and Portland's share will roughly be about $47 million over 10 years on a per capita basis. So if you just split the number about the people from Portland versus the rest of the United States, we're talking about $47 million over 10 years. And while the actual deployment of IRA funds in Portland can vary significantly, and there will be additional non-justice climate funding in the IRA, it is important to note that, with roughly $600 million in PCEF funding over the next 5 years, PCEF will still be the dominant public source of climate justice funding here in Portland. So just to kind of put some context between PCEF and the IRA. And that as of last week, many federal agencies were still developing their rules around the IRA, and many are not. Each agency has a different timeline, and many will not finalize it until kind of spring 2023-ish. So they're still a few months away. And so given PCEF's outsized funding and our timeline, we should be mindful of what the IRA can offer and create opportunities to complement, de-risk, and facilitate mutual capital deployment. But I don't think we should wait and can't wait for the final rules and kind of wait for the IRA. In other words, we should be leading the cart on this. There, I guess, 2 other key observations that I want to share. One is, I think, we need to address capacity challenges. We've already seen firsthand with some of our grantees, the organizational capacities and supply chains are stretched. And given that all the actual extra capital that's about to be deployed, those capacities and chains will be further strained, increasing the odds for delays, failure, and even harm being done to our communities. So I encourage that, as we're developing this CIP, working with economists, convening experts, industry leaders, whoever else that needs to be at table to figure out how best we can accommodate and mitigate these kind of supply chain and capacity challenges that will most likely happen. Secondly is training, education, and awareness is critical. It's very easy in our work to focus on technologies and equipment in our awards. However, often overlooked is the need to incorporate education, training, and awareness around the solutions that we're trying to deploy and scale. Without doing so, for example, tenants won't know how to cook on induction stoves that replace gas ranges. HVAC contractors won't embrace, promote, or design or install heat pump systems. And newly minted BIPOC apprentices won't stay in their jobs because the employers didn't foster an inclusive environment. And so without proper training and education, our investments may be nullified. So finally, throughout our time in DC, James and I noted on numerous occasions all the parallels between the IRA and PCEF, from our guiding principles to our funding priorities to how we root and engage community in our work, to the need of accountability. PCEF has crossed a lot of the paths, that many are still trying to figure out. In our limited conversations, PCEF is being recognized as a pioneer in this space, and we, the committee, stakeholders, staff, and I want to call out especially Sam, Katie, and James, who've been here since the very beginning, that we should all be very proud about the trailblazing work that we've done as others follow our path. And while our path hasn't necessarily been the most direct, we should all know with confidence and conviction that we're definitely headed in the right direction, and should be all very proud of the work that is not only benefiting our community, but is looked as a role model for many others across the country. So that kind of wraps it up. I'm happy to dive deeper offline, and I think James might want to have a comment or two to add.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. And yeah, I agree that there were some really valuable learnings in both the ACEEE conference, as well as some of the meetings that we were able to be a part of and help organize while we were there. I just wanted to share with the committee, I guess, a staff perspective and some of the path forward, just recognizing that there are some really exciting and significant opportunities for decarbonization, good jobs, and innovation in the federal funds that are coming. And some elements, like the tax credits that are going to be available, those will start and roll out, January 1st. People will be eligible for those. But it will take a little bit of time for the federal agencies to launch some of the programs that are focused on equity and income qualified elements like grants and rebates. And some elements of those funding require engagement or application by state agencies to set up the structure for rebates or incentive programs. And so just want to let the committee know that we as staff, or kind of within my role, we'll be working with local and state partners and advocates to ensure that a coordination on that, so there can be equitable benefit by Portlanders and synergy between what we do here within PCEF and additional funds that are available through some of those programs. And so we can continue to update the PCEF committee as these federal programs are launched and come together and highlight their connection to our PCEF priorities. So this is just the beginning, and we're, kind of on an exciting journey all together. And so, really value the opportunity to learn together on that with Robin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robin and James. And before we conclude, Sam, do you have any final or remaining comments or anything you would like to share?
No, just an appreciation. I'm glad, Robin, you were able to go out to DC. Likewise, thank you, James. No, these are busy agendas, and so we will come back and hopefully be refreshed after the holidays and jump right in. So just want to appreciate you all. We'll get these slides up and send those to folks so that you all have these handy. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a very peaceful and healthy holiday. Take care, all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Robin, that was like an inspirational close.